Hello, memoirists, conjurers, mediums, lovers, and grievers. I'm Grant Faulkner. I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today because we're talking with Siri Hustvedt, the author of the memoir Ghost Stories, which is an intimate meditation on grief, memory, and enduring love written in the aftermath of the death of her husband, the writer, poet, and filmmaker, Paul Auster. And it reminds me a lot of Joan Didion's classic memoir of grief, The Year of Magical Thinking, which is a memoir I bet many of our listeners are familiar with. And I want to start, Brooke, by talking about the title for just a moment, Ghost Stories. And in my novel, The Letters, the main character is haunted by a past love who he compares to a ghost because she's very present even though she's absent. And that definition of a ghost in two places at once, a person who either won't leave to go to the other side because they have unfinished business, or they can't leave because they're held back from kind of that metaphorical crossing to the other side because someone or something is holding them back. And I've been thinking all week about how that phrase ghost stories applies to memoir more broadly, because I think every memoir in some sense is a ghost story. So what's your take on that?
I really like it. It also works on so many levels. The most obvious ghost is the person that you've lost. And so Paul Auster in Siri's case, and he literally told her he wanted to come back as a ghost. So I like that because she makes good on that promise, and he is on every single page. And I can think of so many other types of ghosts that memoirs tell about, really, like the ghost of a place left behind, the ghost of a self you've abandoned, the ghost of someone who's abandoned you. That's another big one. And the ghost of a belief that you no longer hold, a self abandoned. I mean, I really think if you got into this, the list goes on and on. It's interesting.
Yeah. Well, with my novel and series memoir, actually, I'm going to pause just one second. I think we should someday make that list of how many different types of ghosts.
Yeah, it could be a competition. Can we get
Yeah.
to 40? Probably.
Yeah, I bet we could. Well, I was thinking because with my novel and series memoir, I kept thinking about the David Foster Wallace line, which I don't think is his line. I think is the title of his biography that I read. But the title is "Every Love Story is a Ghost Story," which I think is one of those sentences that just lands differently the longer you sit with it, because what he means is that love by its nature is haunted by its own ending, and you're always reckoning with loss even when you don't know it yet. And I think Siri's memoir really draws that out. And then I'm going to quote my other bookend for understanding grief and love. It comes from Sigrid Nunez, and I say this a lot. I quote her because I think about this idea a lot, because she says that every story is really about loss. And someday I want to sit down and really explore that to see if it's really true. And she's not saying that stories are necessarily like depressing, but that the things we care about are always at some level in danger of disappearing, or that we're just kind of possessed by loss in some ways even before it happens. And that's what Siri's writing about as well, I think.
Well, absolutely, especially if you think about it in all those multi-layered forms of loss, if you are including abandonment or, something that you don't have anymore. And when you think about it, memoir really is a haunted form because you are trying to hold something that's already gone. And then you become this medium in both senses of the word, like you're a medium through the story that you're telling, and then you're also conjuring something from another time, unearthing stories that are buried. I feel that way. I mean, I feel when I'm writing my memoir, the sense of longing, the sense of nostalgia, and there's grief in that no matter what, like even if the memories are happy ones. And what Siri does that is so interesting to me is that she multiplies the ghosts. It's not just Paul Auster, it's the ghost of who she was when she met him. She also includes love letters that she wrote to him in 1981, which she had not reread in 40 years. So there's this ghost of the young woman who wrote those letters, the ghost of their early love. So here I'm adding to the list, Grant. But it just really resonated with me because I think if you're writing about an earlier version of yourself, you are sort of mourning for that person you were.
Hmm. The ghost of who you were before the person you loved, made you who you are, is such an interesting kind of haunting, because our love, our capacity to love, the way we love, it's all shaped by past love. So most of us are living with multiple ghosts of some sort. And Siri gets into that, saying that our our sense of self is entangled with others, and it's something to disentangle, to understand. And we've talked, Brooke, a lot recently about how the subject of a memoir can shape its form. And you won't be surprised that I loved how Siri shapes this story. It's a patchwork quilt book that stitches together memories through a variety of things. She includes journal entries that she wrote, from the first day that Paul Auster, you know, found out that he had cancer, to the day of his funeral. And she includes emails she sent to friends during his cancer treatment. And then she included notes that Paul sent her over the course of their relationship, and even 3 love letters that she wrote to him in 1981. And the book also contains, most significantly, Paul Auster's last ever piece of writing. The first 35 pages of what he hoped would be a small book of letters written to their grandson, who was coincidentally born just a few months before he died.
Yeah, and I loved that she actually used the word collage in the interview.
Yeah.
Although, of course, your word stitches is perfect. And I'm just going to note, I'm sorry, this is going to be in the recording. Like, people, I have a train, and I have never heard the train go by so many times as it has today. And every time I'm trying to talk, I'm like, it's my turn. Here comes the train. So yes, I live 6 blocks from the train station. But back to Siri. What she's doing is like a diary of sorts, and like many diaries, it's full of holes. And she says it's a geography of telling and not telling. I really love that, a geography of holes, and it's such a precise way to describe what memoir actually is. And also, when we're talking about other kinds of ghosts or other people in the story who show up as ghosts, also Paul Auster's stepson Daniel and his granddaughter Ruby, who died before Paul. She's going to speak to that as well. But those deaths were actually very publicized because Ruby, who was just a baby at the time, died from an acute intoxication, a fatal dose of fentanyl and heroin drugs that Daniel had in the house. And then he overdosed soon after he was charged with manslaughter. I mean, it's an awful story, grief compounded by grief. And so, talking about haunting, it's not a single haunting, it's a whole haunting landscape. And I appreciate what she says about that. She's going to address that head on in the interview. And since you mentioned Year of Magical Thinking by Didion, I want to go back to that because there are similarities. I mean, both of these writers are, of intellectual rigor, trying to think their way through grief in this, kind of nuanced way that, of course, resists solution because there are not solutions. And then both watch themselves from a slight distance, almost in the third person. Siri actually writes at one point, Siri Hustvedt walks around the house and talks to herself, like she's describing a character in the novel that she might have written instead. Of course, it's this collage work of memoir, and it's also a kind of dissociation, Grant. Like watching yourself grieve, and I think that is something I certainly experienced. You have, speaking of haunting, you're kind of haunting your own life, and Didion does that as well in her memoir. And then the Times called Siri's book that basically said like Didion's in tone. But there is a difference, and we asked Siri about it. She speaks to what the difference is for her. But Didion is resistant to consolation, and so the book really holds off any warmth almost to the end, which is very Didion, very, by the way. I mean, I don't envision her to have been a warm person. While Siri has this quality of, I think we might call it like enduring gratitude. The marriage was so good that the grief, is almost a measure of that goodness. And clearly she's written a book that is meant to be a legacy to Paul.
Yeah, I gotta say that that mutual love just shone through the book for me. It was one of the very, entrancing and interesting things is to think about how these two people really did, I mean, form a life that was a single person's life. They were so together. And so I was intrigued by their love story and their obvious devotion to each other. And it was just one of those marriages where they were just, as I said, just so deeply together. And one of the main attractions of this memoir for me is that I got to peek into the lives of New York intellectuals who are kind of like, I don't know, superheroes to me, I guess. I've romanticized that life nearly my entire life. And Siri is a lecturer in psychiatry, and she's written about neuroscience and psychoanalysis and the philosophy of mind. So she's not just experiencing the dissolution of self, she's asking, what is a self anyway? And who am I now that that person who helped constitute myself is gone? Which is such an interesting way to approach grief, I think, and unique. But at the same time, I think every memoir is asking some version of that question, and that's why ghosts are the right metaphor. Ghosts are what remain when the thing that made you solid is gone. And memoir is the form that tries to make the ghost visible, to say, this person was here, this love was here, this version of me was here, it happened, even if I can't quite reach it anymore.
I love this so much. It's opening a whole new arena of understanding for me, around like how we are treating what is no longer here, in the present, even if it exists, right? Like even if
Mm-hmm.
people are still alive, or, certainly we are still alive as we're writing our memoirs. But let's talk to Siri about all of this. Her new memoir, Ghost Stories, is all of these things, an attempt to reach something that's just out of reach and to make the reaching itself beautiful. So we'll be back after this very short break.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited to talk to our special guest today, Siri Hustvedt. She is the author of a book of poetry, 4 collections of essays, 2 works of nonfiction, and 7 novels, including the international bestsellers What I Loved and The Summer Without Men. Her most recent novel, The Blazing World, was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and won the Los Angeles Book Prize for fiction. And in 2012, she was awarded the International Gabarron Prize for Thought and Humanities. And in 2019, the Princess Asturias Prize, the Spanish Nobel, I've just found out. And she's won a bunch of other prizes as well. And she has a PhD in English from Columbia University and is a lecturer in psychiatry at Weil Cornell Medical College in New York. And she's the author of the book we're discussing today, Ghost Stories. Thank you so much for joining us, Siri.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a special treat because I've been reading you for a long time, and I've read Paul Auster, of course, as well. And Brooke and I were just discussing the nature of ghosts and how ghosts really are the perfect metaphor for memoir, because we write memoir to understand the ghosts in our lives, in essence, and perhaps even to release them so we can go on without them. And I think it's interesting that you titled your memoir Ghost Stories and not Ghost Story. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about your title and how it guided your book.
It was a unconscious impulse that rose to consciousness. I was sitting in a chair only days after Paul died, and I knew I was going to embark on a writing project about us. And the title rose up from somewhere, and I never changed it. I have changed titles at various moments in my life. I started writing a book, I have a title, and then I realized that the title doesn't fit the book as it, opens and changes. But in this case, I felt very sure that that was the right title because, as you were saying, ghosts are strong metaphors for all kinds of things, including writing itself, because all representations, including linguistic ones, are disembodied.
Why the plural, Siri?
Because after 43 years of living with the same person, I knew that there were a number of stories, not one single narrative thread to follow. And indeed, the book has a fragmented form, which I intended to mirror the state of my grief, but also to mirror our life together that took us into various crevices and corners of our shared reality.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it's effective. And you do describe the book as a diary of sorts, and like many diaries, it's full of holes, a geography of telling and not telling. So I'm curious about those holes specifically. What did you decide not to tell? And maybe there's too much to say there, or conversely, like how did you write around the holes?
Yes, I think I had a strong sense of how I wanted the form of the book to feel. And that sounds vague, but indeed, I had elements that I knew I was going to integrate into the form of the book so that it would have a kind of collage aspect. But I also realized that the balance, the rhythm of the book was hugely important to me. So one of the chapters that I worked on the hardest was where I include information about the neurology of presences, for example. I went into that much more deeply in an earlier draft, and I realized it was weighing down the book in ways that I didn't want it to be weighed down in. And that is a tendency of mine to get really interested in a topic and and keep following it. But in this case, I wanted the book to be balanced. So some meditations on what it might mean to experience a presence in grief, but it had to be balanced with the other material that I had chosen to include. That's one telling and not telling. And then I was also very conscious of including the story of my stepson Daniel and Paul and my granddaughter Ruby, who died at 10 months. And Daniel was arrested, and when he was let out on bail, he overdosed on heroin and fentanyl, which is what killed Ruby. This is such a gruesome and terrible story, and it was so painful to live through for Paul and for me, that I knew, because it was publicized everywhere in Asia, in India, in Europe, in everywhere, that it had to be included in the story of our life together, because it would be utterly fraudulent not to include it. But I also knew that it wasn't the entire story I wanted to tell. And so it had to be present, it had to be there, but I didn't want it to completely derail the narrative about life between us, because in fact it didn't.
That's interesting to think about, especially because I'm thinking that I guess I read my first grieving memoirs after my father died. It was my way of grieving, was to read, kind of like a lot of writers, I think. And I read Roland Barthes' Mourning Diary, his notebooks after his mother's death. And what strikes me about it and about your book is the way grief interrupts. It doesn't flow. It kind of can ambush you in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. And I also read Zadie Smith, that she wrote that grief spirals rather than progresses. And so I was wondering if those interruptions and spiraling, informed the rhythm of your writing, your story in any way.
They're both interesting ideas, and I do think interruption is a powerful image, because grief can, some object, some memory can unleash a torrent of grief that you don't expect. I mean, you're not ready for it. So I think interruption is really good. I don't know about the spiraling. I think I experienced my own grief as a feeling of being outside time, a feeling of fragmentation, and that the course of grief for me, after 2 years now, is that my habit body has become more adjusted to being alone. And that has been part of the course of grief. And that has allowed me to enter time again in a way that I couldn't before. The other huge difference is that Paul was part of my everyday perceptual reality. He was in my day-to-day life every single day. So part of my grieving, or the process of grieving, is that now I think I've adjusted to the fact that he's not in my everyday perceptual reality.
Thank you for putting it that way. It really is a journey. And I want to ask another question about structure, because we've talked a lot on the subject of the ways that memoir shapes the story, kind of the notion of the memoir knowing what it wants to be. And your book is formally unusual in that it braids your entries, emails you sent to friends during Paul's illness, love letters from 1981, plus Paul's own unfinished letters to your grandson. You just called it a collage form, and we're very interested in that too in terms of narrative structure. But what made you decide to weave all of those texts together rather than write a straightforward narrative? I mean, did you
Yeah,
know
well,
what it was going to
because I
be?
think that using documents, my letters to Paul, some of his notes to me, the letters he intended to become a book called Letters to Miles that he couldn't finish. It was written, all the pages, 35 pages, were written in the penultimate month of his life, just a little bit into April, until he knew from a scan that he was going to die. And then that was when he stopped writing. I think after he knew he was dying, he wrote the very last letter to Miles, and he hoped to write more then, he said, but he was really too weak to continue. And I did think, what am I going to do with those 35 pages? And then it came to me, because I already had the desire to include documents from our past together, that it would be a very good use of those letters, because it was really just too short. It was a aborted project. But what happens when you include documents is an issue of time, because you are able to experience the immediacy of the time of the document. So one of the reasons I included the letters to friends that I wrote during Paul's treatment was because I realized, reading them again, that I could never have summarized the narrative of his illness as, as efficiently and well as I did in those letters. For one reason, you forget. And when you're reporting in the throes of a treatment story, you really feel the progress of both the illness and the treatment. So I realized I could not have done a better job on hindsight. And I think the immediacy brings the reader into the ups and downs of cancer treatment in a way that I couldn't have mimicked.
Yeah, I was just about to comment that the letters or your emails from Cancerland, they served exactly that purpose as a reader. They brought me out of your larger narration into this different spot, whereas it was interesting to me to watch you both as a writer writing them, and then to think of myself as the people receiving them too, because they're not living this, and how does one react to that? Yeah, and I guess I was thinking largely about writing as well, because sometimes oddly moments like this are moments when my writing actually shuts down, and other than doing functional writing, I can't really write personally. So was writing a way of processing and a way of keeping people at the right distance, or a way of narrating yourself through something that's really unnarratable?
I think so, because I wrote, even, I think of it now, that after Paul died, I wrote about his death in a journal. And again, that was right on the heels of his death that very night. And I do feel that in a state of profound distress and fragmentation that the work I did on the book, but also writing in my journal during some of the worst moments of Paul's treatment, create a coherence on the page that I didn't have. This is a very strange thing to say. I recognize how odd it sounds, but I actually believe that to be the case. That at moments of extremity, writing can be a way of creating coherence. And early in the book, I say, here I am, I'm writing these sentences. One word is following another, and I can do it. So I needed the book at the time I wrote it. And there is, as you mentioned earlier, a kind of hidden diary, or rather a diary that surfaces, that is keeping the time of the book itself. And then there are the other times imposed on it, the time of the treatment, which is the letters, the time very close to his death when Paul was writing the letters to Miles that are interspersed inside the text. But I had a moment early on, and I thought I would put the 35 pages together, that you would have Paul's voice moving through the letters. And I realized very quickly that it didn't work. It did not work well. And then I also understood that because I think of our 43 years together as a long, dynamic dialogue, that by giving the reader my voice and then Paul's voice, and they're different, you can feel it in the rhythms of the prose, you can feel that these are two different forms of expression, that also imitated the dialogical nature of our marriage.
It's a beautiful description. I was kind of having this image of the writing itself being the lantern guiding you through the grief or something. It's just, it's
I know.
powerful.
I don't think I've ever quite, felt that way before in my work. I have often said, the book knows more than I do. And I think what I mean by that is that clearly when one writes, there are forms of unconscious activity that are going on, and you're not fully aware of where they're coming from. And for me, that often involves a kind of rhythmic reality. I think of works of art in terms of rhythm.
Well, your work has also been compared to the year of magical thinking because you have two intellectual writers trying to think through something that resists any kind of final solution. So, do you see Didion as a companion or a predecessor here in your own work?
I hadn't actually read that book until after Paul died. So I read it then. And what interested me, that is certainly one of the best ones. And another was C.S. Lewis's book I had also not read before, A Grief Observed, which I found really beautiful and do quote briefly from. Those two were high on the good, the good ones list. What was interesting to me, even in those sterling examples, is that the dead person really isn't part of the book. Paul and I knew Joan and John a little bit, and at social occasions we had dinner with them and other people, several times. And one thing I can say, I always felt those two human beings had a real wonderful rapport that you could feel. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And And that always made me feel good. It's a pleasant feeling to be around, people who have that kind of rapport. Not that it was hugely demonstrative. I could just feel it, Anyway, but John is not really in that book. I mean, he's in there, stories that she shares, but it's an anatomy of grief, which is also C.S. Lewis. It's an anatomy of his grief, beautifully done. But I wanted something else. I wanted to resurrect my Paul on the page, and I tried to do that. That was the dominant impulse that I had. And it turns out that is not a dominant impulse in grief memoirs. Most of them are anatomies of grief, done in, often, I'm afraid to say, lesser ways, and then some in really beautiful ways.
That's such an interesting distinction, and I hadn't thought about Joan Didion's book quite in that light until you said that, and it's really true. And it's bringing to mind, I just read this quote by Ocean Vuong, that grief is the final translation of love, which I thought was just such a fantastic definition of love. And it seems like that's part of what you're doing here.
Yes, I think so. I had another thought after I finished the book, and I put it in an essay, that what grief is unrequited love.
Mm.
Not in the past. You've had this love affair, in my case, a long one, and then it's over. And you don't stop loving the person. You don't stop, even though the person is dead. And that is, in a way, the great tragedy of grief. It's unrequited love. And you can't talk yourself out of loving, This is not an easy thing. You don't talk yourself out of it. So, yes, it might indeed be the final translation of love, a moving comment. But it's also horribly frustrating because it's unanswered.
You wrote, or you ask in the book, divested of others, what exactly is a self? And, you've written that selfhood is always entangled with other people. And especially in this case, after 43 years of being entangled with Paul Auster, can you describe for listeners, who you were in those immediate months after his death, and who you are now, I guess, in the writing of this book, and maybe especially in reference to that unrequited love metaphor, which is so interesting?
I think that in my case, I was prepared for Paul's death. I had been thinking about it actually throughout the cancer treatment, about a year and a half. And even before he was diagnosed officially with cancer, as I say in the very first paragraph of the book, he was admitted to Mount Sinai West Hospital in New York City. There was a CT scan done, and the radiologist saw a mass in his lung and said it could be cancer. So cancer still, despite the fact that many people do survive cancer, it's nevertheless a possible death sentence. And if you don't think about it, you're maybe suppressing reality. So I started thinking about Paul's possible death, something I'd thought about a great deal even before he was ill, a lot. Nevertheless, the state I found myself in, especially the bizarre relationship to time, was something I did not expect. I expected all kinds of aspects of grief that did indeed come true, but not that. And so the book is a record, and sometimes with humor. I have to say I never lost my sense of humor, about the evolution of those 9 months after Paul died, and slowly actually regaining some kind of rhythmic relationship to time, or timing that I had lost by the end. And I have it more now. And some of what I called cognitive splintering, my term for memory issues, and a real feeling of fragmentation that again surprised me, got better. That has gotten considerably better. It turns out, and I did not put this in the little neurological part of the book, but actually the hippocampus that is connected powerfully to memory in the brain shrinks and can atrophy in grief. It's documented by neuroscientists. And I think that's what happened to me. Later, it regenerates itself, unlike other memory disorders that simply get worse and worse and worse.
That's very fascinating.
Kind of fascinating, right? Yes, it is. And I didn't know that until I knew that traumatic experiences could have that effect on the hippocampus. And I probably, if I had thought a little harder, would have put grief into that category. It is a kind of trauma, and it's a bodily trauma. This is what people have a hard time recognizing, I think, because we still separate the mental and the physical, and we throw grief into the mental basket. But of course, it's an embodied subject that's experiencing grief, and this is very much a physiological story as well.
Well, in closing, we wanted to ask you about Paul's letters to Miles, which we evoked earlier, but they're written to a child who will only know him as absence. And you could say, of course, as story, as ghost, and they are quite extraordinary. So, what was it like to include his writing inside of yours? I mean, you've spoken to doing it, but, and maybe that was really what you were trying to do, resurrect him, but say a little bit more.
Well, it's true that there's something really moving for me to include his living voice in the book, the last examples of his living writing voice. And it gave me tremendous pleasure when I was typing the manuscript to type over those letters. Of course, I had them beside me, and to feel, well, in my fingers and in my head and in my heartbeat, the music of Paul's prose that is a different music from my own. And that gave me a renewed sense of our intimacy. So it was a real pleasure. And I do think that Paul would have been very happy about how I used the letters. I never would have done it if I thought he would have felt betrayed, or that was a kind of misuse of his little manuscript. I'm confident that he would have liked it.
Hmm.
I think it's the perfect way to present them. I was thinking that earlier when you mentioned them, rather than publishing them separately. It is part of this story.
Book, it would have been, and I also think, it would have been sadder, because Paul does say in one of the letters, I had intended to make a little book of 1 to 200 pages, and 35 isn't even close. So the real sadness of that, I think, is partly alleviated. It is the second to last text in the book, his letter. And then there's the little heroic couplets that I wrote for him, Christmas 2023. And I knew that those were going to be the last beats of the book. His voice, and then that little poem that Paul loved so much. He was really crazy about those couplets. So that was also my gift to him that Christmas, and the sort of the last moment in the book, because he was so fond of them and had them framed, and I still have them in the frame.
No, beautiful. Well, what a legacy book.
Yeah, but
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I've avoided that kind of sentimentality mostly. It's not really my thing.
Well, I could feel your rapport in this book as well with Paul. That's one of the things that made it magical. So thank you so much for joining us and telling us all
Thank you
about it.
so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Siri. What a pleasure. Well, Grant, I want to talk about something that's been on my mind and something that I wrote about recently for our Memoir Nation Substack newsletter, which is the fate of the linear narrative in memoir. And that's because I feel like it's become almost unfashionable. Like if you tell someone you're writing memoir linearly, they might look at you a little sideways, like maybe you haven't gotten the memo. And my post was inspired by the fact that this is turning into some writers worrying about their own memoirs' linear structures and whether they're even allowed to do that now that this fragmentary style is so much more in vogue.
Yeah, I know we've each been excited and intrigued how memoir is really morphing into other forms. And I think that really speaks to its maturation and its urgency. And as that's basically been my form of writing for literally 15 years. So it's been especially interesting for me to talk to, some of our brilliant guests who we've had on this year who write in that form, Eleni Sikilianos and Melissa Febos and Sarah Aziza. But here's the thing: we've had just as many guests who write linearly. I'm thinking of Susan Orlean, Andre Debus III, Maria Hornbacher. And I don't think the linear narrative is going anywhere, obviously, because it's the foundation of storytelling. It's like one thing happened, then it caused another thing to happen, and that caused another thing to happen. Our brains are wired for that form of storytelling.
Yeah, and that's why I really want to stick up for the linear narrative. I always have. Like, I am actually writing my own memoir linearly, and I spent about 6 months convinced that I was doing it wrong. After Maggie Smith's "You Could Make This Place Beautiful" came out, I actually threw out 30,000 words. I tried to reconstruct my book in a more kaleidoscopic way, like doing shorter pieces. I kind of unstitched and restitched, and then I ended up circling back to a lot of my original scenes and realizing that the linear storytelling was right for my book. And in part because of this cause and effect that you mentioned, one thing happens, that's the catalyst for the next. And I really can't see a way for me to create tension and like the unfolding of what happened needs to happen as it happened. And so I realized that it was as if my memoir wanted to be linear and that I was almost trying to talk it out of it. And so I regrouped and I went back to linear.
Yeah, well, good thing you did. It's interesting. I think Maggie Smith's "You Could Make This Place Beautiful" is the kind of seminal book for this movement. It's really changed the way a lot of people write, and obviously, as you say, not all stories fit in that container. So it's interesting to explore it, but it's also it's not the way to write, even though so many people are trying to do it that way. And it's interesting for me too, because my natural inclination is a little bit the opposite of yours. I just don't genuinely think of life as a round, complete circle. But as listening to you too, my story isn't so much cause and effect driven. It's more like a collage of snapshots. So for me, the fragment isn't really a trend. It's practically an existential or aesthetic position, because the collage form allows me to capture the way my brain thinks of experience. And then it also allows me to capture all those kind of in-between moments and states that aren't connected to the linear cause and effect so much.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful way to write. I also think there's a conflation happening, and that's always been the case probably between structure and form, because you can write a linear memoir that includes lists and photographs, poetry, journal entries, all of which we might qualify as experimental forms. But structure is the architecture, and so form is the shape that those rooms take within the house or building that you're making. And so I am writing linearly, but I've also found that incorporating experimental forms has been very freeing and kind of opening up to maybe some of the stuff that I was admiring about Maggie Smith's book. And ultimately, I think that will make the book better, but the structure is still linear.
Yeah. Well, it's a very useful distinction. And when Eleni Sisklianos, she said on our podcast that writing linearly is a form of lying, I think she meant to be provocative in that her approach is for the subject to form the shape of her story instead of how she sees it as forcing it into a pre-existing structure.
Yeah, I think I understood it to be that way too, because you have to recreate in memoir. You have to conjure, you have to lean into what you don't remember. But I don't call that lying, I call it evoking. And that is just what memoir is. And it's true no matter what form or structure you're writing, linearly or in fragments, you always have to do that evoking.
Ming Chang said something that's stayed with me on our podcast, and she said that she follows language to find her story, and that the language, serves itself. And I think that's what both of us are really talking about: following what your story needs, whether that's a line or a shard or a footnote, or a linear form. And Lydia Davis, actually, I've always thought about this quote a lot. I want to get your reaction to it. She said that any complete picture is an illusion, and a picture that seems less complete may paradoxically seem more realistic.
And that's a great argument for the fragment. And I guess what I would say is that for some stories, the complete picture isn't an illusion. It's the whole point. And so I think one of the things is like anytime you say something very conclusive, you almost automatically have to put a qualifier on that because tons of us are writing memoirs and we're all doing it differently. One thing that's true is that the reader does have to feel time passing. And I'll put a little plug in for the fact that I'm doing a whole class about time at Memoir Nation in July. And time is really, really meaningful and important no matter what kind of structure you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that we're having to stick up for the linear narrative as if it's a daring new approach. It's a rogue approach to writing. So I think we're both, we're basically against the idea that the fragment is inherently more sophisticated. I think that's what it's being oftentimes held up to be.
Well, exactly. I mean, the linear form is classic. And I think what happens is that a lot of people are like, oh, I want to tell my story that way. And then they feel guilty or shamed or unsophisticated. And I think the point of covering this today is to say that one structure's rise does not mean another structure's collapse. It simply means that the genre is maturing. And so writers are bringing more forms to it. And all of that is wonderful. I've always said and truly believe that your memoir knows what it wants to be. And so you just have to listen to it and then follow it. And sometimes it will take, you will take yourself away from that and come back to it. And, that's part of the journey of this long journey that is getting a book done.
Well, thanks for this discussion, Brooke, and thanks for defending the linear narrative. Somebody had to do it. You might go down in memoir history as bringing the linear narrative back. And as I hope you know, listeners, we're really here to help you find your story and then tell it in the way that best suits you. So if you haven't signed up for membership in memoirnation.com, please do so. Tell your friends about it. We're building a community there. And we're talking about subjects like this and more in the community every day. And we'll be talking about subjects like this on this podcast as well. So please keep tuning in. And yeah, once again, invite a friend to join you so you can continue the conversation in real life.